Allora, buonasera a tutti, buonasera a tutte. Siamo molto felici di cominciare questa lunga cavalcata di Open Museum, Open City, con questa chiacchierata, con questo confronto con Charles Guarino sul progetto di questo museo e in generale sul senso e il significato di un ripensamento, di un reshaping, diciamo così, di un'istituzione pubblica come questa. Allora, la prima domanda che io vorrei farvi è capire se per caso possiamo svolgere questa conversazione in inglese. Se però c'è qualcuno che invece chiede l'italiano, siamo anche in grado di avere un interprete. Se no, quindi come facciamo? Inglese? Ok. Ah, ok, perfetto. Ok, so let's switch to English and you don't need any earphone. I mean, you may need some earphone if we get some questions later, but we can start with English.
Primo voglio dire un vergogno
e benvenuto
per me, perché io sono italiano, ma sono molto facile per me parlare di mangiare, ma dopo la frutta sono completamente inutile, scusami.
Sì, va bene, io sono seduta qui tra due signori che dicono di non parlare l'italiano, che lo parlano perfettamente.
Sì, non cinese.
Ecco, appunto, e che in realtà se qualcuno vuole dire qualcosa di nascosto da loro in italiano non lo faccia, perché capiscono perfettamente tutto. Ok, Charles.
Dice lei.
Sì, dico io. Do you want to help us kicking off the conversation?
Yeah, first let me say grazie Giovanna, grazie Ho. It's kind of an honor for me to be here in what I generally think of as one of the most difficult museums in the world. I'm such a great admirer of these people because I think that what they're doing here is really amazing. I think that what Hanru is doing is a kind of, it takes a kind of curatorial courage, a heroism, to come into this museum and try and imagine contemporary art in it, because in itself it's a piece of art, and as such tends to sort of reject most of the art that comes in. So having something come in and fit in is perfect. In a way, this is the perfect show for this museum, mostly because the museum is empty. I think that what Giovanna is doing is a kind of administrative heroism, to come to a place like this, to take a facility like this, and with virtually no money, create an environment that's open to everyone here. I think that we tend to live in a very secular society, so museums assume an outsized role in kind of shaping community events, because I think that what tends to bind us now in the 21st century, those of us who aren't, you know, overtly religious, is culture. The things that we make, the things that we do, it's the art that binds us. And I think that as a community, we need a place in which to do that. And I think that the people who do Maxi have done an incredible job in doing that. Alessandro, mi dispiace.
Yeah.
But let's see, just are there people who need the translation?
Here, sì.
Ma in diretta? Ah, ok.
Perfetto.
Ok, allora.
Okay. Charles, of course, you know, I would like to also start with the question, not really a question, being the editor, the publisher of our forum, which is a major art magazine today. It's almost like one of the few reference having a kind of global, if not monopoly, but somehow hegemony in terms of formatting the opinions on contemporary arts. And the story of the art forum itself has been also very, very interesting, in the sense that it started with a group of artists and critics in the 60s in California, well, contemporary art was still kind of minority activity, and it became today a kind of major, let's say, aspect of cultural life in many places. And I think the magazine itself has been a kind of witness of this process, while it becomes also part of this machine. Right? One really interesting thing, I guess you have this incredible experience with this magazine. Over time, how do you observe the evolution of museums as a public institution? How do you see that starting from the American museums to now more globalized kind of situation?
Well, I think that it's almost impossible to compare the American situation and largely the European situation with the situation here in Italy. I think no country, this is a country that is only 150 years old, and yet they have been charged, you have been charged with a patrimony that's 3,000 years old. So could you please take care of that? And by the way, remember that you live in the present. And that's kind of virtually impossible. In America, of course, following in the post-war years, there was an enormous amount of money. So the state infrastructure for art was completely different. Museums played a role for us because we had no patrimony. We were a country without history. So we didn't have to worry. We just had to worry about what we had. So during the Industrial Revolution, the Metropolitan Museum of Art was built, the Frick was built, some great collections were finding homes. Following that, you have the evolution of the Museum of Modern Art, the evolution of the Whitney Museum of Art, the Walker Art Center, the Los Angeles Center for Contemporary Art, Chicago MoCA. These were all things that happened while you guys were busy trying to figure out what to do with Pompeii and the Colosseo and the rest of it. So the role that museums play in the States has always been, one of community, a place where people come together to celebrate that which they have made generationally and culturally, as opposed to here, where there isn't virtually no museum infrastructure for contemporary art, for the art of, for you. You have this. Mostly what happens here is in private hands. So in Italy, like mushrooms, they pop up. Fondazione questo, fondazione quello, fondazione quell'altro.
Yeah, this is a very important institutional issue here. I try and insert myself in the and we are questioning ourselves. We are asking ourselves how we need to reshape a public institution. I mean, this is a publicly funded institution, partially publicly funded institution, definitely with little money, but with the possibility of matching fundings with the private. I mean, this is a real challenge for us, looking and searching a different model, which is not the American Anglo-Saxon model. It's not the l'état c'est moi model, because we can't afford it anymore. So it's really seeing how this institution can build in new relationships with the private sector, but making sure that that we are free, making sure that we are a free platform. And this is the challenge that we face daily. The other thing is, I don't want to look at Maxi as a museum. Maxi is not a museum. I mean, it is in the sort of physical notion. We have exhibition areas, but this is a research center. This is a productive. Max is a platform for creativity. So I think this part, and Hanru with this show has so much engaged us in considering ourselves this. I mean, opening up to the process of creativity and having it, just occupy Maxi. This is what is happening.
Yeah, of course, you know, the notion of the museum, very often people kind of understand it as a collection institution. In fact, many institutions in the world has become, especially those working with contemporary art, has become a platform of production, of research, of exchange, also as collection. We also have collection, but what to collect, how to collect, is also a very challenging question, how to bring a new answer to what to collect, how to collect. And I would like to hear a little bit your opinion on how you see collection.
Well, I'd have to go back to the whole idea of, you know, patrimonio and what it means to take relics from your age and have them somehow represent, you know, the ideas of a certain time. Not to diverge, but I put this slide up just because it was probably the first time, and I'm so happy they let me come here to put up a lot of pictures of art for them, for you to look at. This is a picket line in front of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I just thought it was, since we may have a strike here tomorrow, I thought it would be an interesting cover to put. People striking outside the museum because of low wages. And I'm just noticing for the first time the word pasta there, which I'm not really sure. Più spaghetti, meno chiacchiere.
Con la cultura si mangia.
You know, I think that in a way, this is the Museum of Modern Art in its first iteration. They didn't really have a budget for collecting. Like most of the collections here in Italy, it was private collections that were then ceded to the public trust. One of the reasons that could happen in the United States, and it could happen in Germany, it could happen in Switzerland, anywhere but here, is because built into the state structure is a way to reward people for giving over this material to the state. So the collections sometimes arrive en masse. You know, Eli Broad, you know, donating his collection en masse. An American named Nancy Olnick, who just donated the largest collection of Italian glass in private hands. She's going to donate that to the Museum of Modern Art, and isn't that nice? However, in return, she's going to get a tax subsidy that allows it to be remunerative for her. That doesn't exist here. So for me, I don't know how, and I don't know when, but I think if people were somehow encouraged to donate to the public trust, it would, because I do think collections are important. I do think it's important to walk into a museum and know that the permanent collection is a living record of what's been happening in contemporary
I like
art.
the saying living record, because, you know, we had this collection exhibition which is called Non Basta Ricordare. Basically, it's about, you know, collection is something living, continue to live, continue to grow.
Generate.
Yeah, and also generate new possibility of, you know, producing new projects. Let's carry on with your presentation. I think it's really very interesting, starting with the museum is on strike. Hopefully our staff is not going on strike.
Don't calm.
It's a bad idea.
Calm.
I don't know why you wanted to start with this right today. is this an idea to follow?
It's chronological. I did try to choose covers that I thought would be provocative in this context. This is a very famous essay that, in a way, characterized what was going to happen for the next 40 years at Art Forum. I want to say, in its way, everything this museum is not. You know, I once went to a lecture by Bice Kuriger in Zurich, and she said, come, we were going out to dinner. She said, come to the lecture, I'm giving it to the Architectural Society. And I said, but I don't speak Schweizerdeutsch. She said, don't worry, you'll understand everything. So she got in front of the audience, and she stood behind the podium, and she said, architects hate art. And then she showed 20 slides of museums where it was clear you know, in those cases. This is basically an argument that says, you know, form, when it comes to art, must follow function, which would be nice in an ideal world. But I can tell you, 4 out of 8 museums in the world are the architect's vision, and the art is subsumed into that vision. So I'm curious how you guys feel about that.
Well, I think it's really interesting that maybe I just tell you one anecdote. A few years ago, I moved from Paris to San Francisco to pick up this little place in the institute. The first day when I arrived there, I told my team, say, from now on, we have no budget to buy white paint. We have a lot of money to do anything you want, but not a lot of money, but we can afford to buy different kinds of paints to repaint the walls, but instead of white. So the reason is very simple. It's because America is such an interesting place where modernism arrived in this continent, and this country becomes completely, on the one hand, perfectly matured, on the other hand, becomes completely orthodoxical. So if you don't have a white cube, you're not supposed to be a modern and contemporary art museum, basically. That's the legacy of the MoMA, right? And under this, you also have to follow basically what Alfred Barr has written as a structure of modernism, right? So all these things actually, at a certain point, one has to test out if you break it, what will happen? Maybe there's a moment of high risk, is also a moment of emancipation, let's say. And not only to allow us to look at art in a different way, and also to encourage artists to look at themselves in a different way. And I think what art actually can tell us is this, and a museum like this, actually, we are in a kind of white cube, which is not really a standard white cube, it's more like a white paint highway system. Basically, we're sitting in the middle of a highway, right? And in the meantime, this is not only something that very difficult to handle if you want to imagine a conventional painting or sculpture exhibition, but it's also a very exciting challenge for everyone to think about that. So this is not only, I guess, it's not only a formalist question, how to produce new forms to go with that. Maybe in the head of the designer, the first idea is to have Anish Kapoor sculpture next to a Jeff Koons dog. And that's more or less that kind of vision. If you look at the rendering of the design, and you see the typical image of exhibitions in a contemporary museum, very often it's looking like that. But I think it has to do with how to imagine another concept of work as an opera, as an operating system. It's like a operare, rather than simply an object, right? So how to bring a kind of articulated moment in life into this place, and this is essential. And then another challenge, I guess, is also institutional. It's also organizational, hence financing. How one can imagine an organization that works for the operating instead of works for its own eternal self-justification. And this is also something very interesting to think about.
I think this has a lot to do with how do we work for, well, this morning we used this word in the press conference, una riattivatore sociale. So we want to spend public money to do that. We don't want to spend public money to reactivate the market. We want to spend public money to reactivate the creative process. And I am sure that by doing that, we are also somehow challenging the economics of art. And not only of art, in fact, but the economics of creativity in this country. Because, I mean, this would bring me far away, and I don't want to sort of get you out of the path.
No, let's go far away.
Let's go far away. Well, if we go far away, I think that one thing that this country needs is to recognize that we have, you know, art and creativity embedded in our productive system. And if we don't recognize that as our identity, I mean, I'm not talking about Maxi now, I'm talking about Italy, and as our real, you know, down to earth, the root of our identity, we would not go anywhere. So it was for us, the first challenge was to see, okay, we have little money, but how are we going to spend it? Even if it's little, we do have to, you know, say some yes and some no's. And we do have to select and make choices. So if this has to become un riattivatore sociale, this is where our money is going to flow. Naturally, we need help, and I think that the fact that we are building around Maxi a very large community, I am impressed. I mean, I am positively impressed by the amount of energy and help that we are receiving from, you know, from the benefactors and donors and even single citizens. We're always in front of this dilemma, because on one side what we're doing is, you know, for example, this show will be offered freely on weekends to young people, thanks to Enel. I said it this morning, let me say it again. And I think that over and over we will have to do this. We will have to have areas of the museum that are free access. And the more we get private money, the more this money will go into that. So we have to support the cultural demand. But it is interesting that, in fact, this is quite a surprise for us, that selecting the way we devote money in this way is not keeping private donations far away, but in fact it's activating them. So maybe this is something we should think about it. We don't necessarily need to reactivate the market to have the market in.
I don't know anything about the market.
It's not true.
Just to pull it back in a little bit, I always tell my staff, don't think outside the box, think inside the box. Because it's within limitations where creativity thrives. And I truly believe that. So I think that one of the reasons they're obliged to be so creative is because they have to work within the framework of this building. But it's the buildings themselves that I would like to talk about, because I think that certainly in this country, which I know and love very well and very much, but in a lot of places, artists and curators are not brought into the dialogue soon enough. Museums tend to be built by politicians and architects. So the architect, who, by the way, is a creative person who wants to see their vision realized, who wants to have galleries that do this or do that, or have cantilevered walls, and that's really great for them. And the decisions are made in closed rooms. They're very seldom open to the people who really need to use it. They tend to be less purpose-built structures and more, let's say, ego-built structures. And so that at the end of the day, everyone in the parliament applauds themselves. Didn't we do great? And the architect is fabulous. They've built this great monument to themselves. And the artists, well, they can go stuff it for the next 50 years. And that's what kind of interests me. I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about evidence. Well, I guess really the question is, we are in a time that we somehow encourage to produce visionary stuff. But visionary without relevance, without a historical depth, it's always problematic. It's always, and of course, one also has to say that, you know, when certain buildings were built in history, criticizing. Everyone was, hating it. Take one example, the Pompidou Center, right? But there was a relevance. The relevance came at the fact that it has, it was responding to a kind of momentum of creativity in general that we are looking into break through from a very conservative kind of ideology of creation to embracing an open society. The whole 60s movement, 70s movement, and so on. And that actually provided very interesting, very challenging image for us to know how to use that place. People invent new usage of that kind of, but when this thing goes into a kind of rococo moment, like today, and it goes to another way, which is a pure spectacle, as Debord and so on criticized that 50 years ago it was already starting, and today we are going to the summit of this spectacle. The ultimate thing is not a response to the momentum of creativity, but instead it's a illusion, a false image of a kind of fantasy that actually becomes a force of alienation, let's say. So, and one of the interesting things that this building provides us is the question, how to work with that and against it at the same time, and propose a new usage of this building. I don't think this is a bad building per se. It's also not a great building per se. It's a very interesting building because there's so many questions, so many problems that need us to answer. And the answer doesn't simply find itself in artworks, and also in terms of the synergy among artists, curators, administration, and also social reactions, public. How we can come together to actually invent other ways to help us to go beyond this constraint and to turn this very difficult kind of physical condition into something, let's say, amusing. This is what museum means, right? At the end of the day, museum is about music. It's something inspires.
You want to bring people in the house. Yeah. I would like to say that I entirely believe in globalization. Art form was global from the first minute it was born. We had an artist nobody heard of on the cover that came from 5,000 miles from San Francisco. There were 27 reviews in the magazine, and only 2 of them were from San Francisco, where the magazine originated, and 1 of them was at a museum. So I believe in, but I also believe in localization. One of the reasons Germany is so strong in contemporary art is because German collectors collect German artists. German collectors contribute to German museums. If you ask me, I think, and I don't want to become too local here, but I say this as an Italian person, Italian people should love they should love themselves more, not less. This is a place that has some of the most talented architects in the world. And just by nature of their nationality, they love art, they adore art. They are virtually incapable of building a museum that isn't purpose-built. I would compare, Renzo Piano to Rem Koolhaas any day, and take Rem and just send him, go build something on the moon. Because if you ask me, architecture, when it comes to museums, is at its best when it understands why it has to be there, when it surrenders to its purpose.
I want to actually move on with your images, because I remember yesterday I saw the first, this is great, and this is really great. And this is what artists, audience are doing in museums.
8 out of 10 museums in Italy, I would say. And this is simply, you know, this is a very interesting moment for MoMA. This is in 1998 when Rob Storr was one of the chief curators there at MoMA, and this is Chuck's exhibition. And here, it just illustrates a great communion between the curator, the artist, and the institution, where they're just all working together. And this show, by the way, was absolutely fantastic. I mean, and this isn't funny, entirely handicapped access. So, you know, God bless them.
Nice to check.
Yes. This is, you know, the Pergamon Museum. It's Thomas Struth, who's fabulous. Just an incredible portrait of the King and Queen, by the way, which is really terrific, of England. And I don't know, I'm not sure why I chose this, but I go to the Pergamon Museum and I'm in awe. Mostly I'm in awe of what's in there, but I'm in awe of the fact that this German platoon marched in and said, oh, Gates of Babylon, let's take that. They just did. They took it home. The English were very good at that also. Here in Italy we have plenty.
Well, just, the French were too.
Yes, they were. Yes, yes, they were. But feel free to stop me at any point. This is interesting because I think this had a particular resonance for me. As Giovanna knows, Art Forum and MoMA have had a very contentious relationship for their entire history. MoMA does something, we crucify them. And yet, one of my best friends in the world is the director of MoMA. You know, and I love this guy, and yet, we had to publish this article, which was an excoriating review of the new edition. And we chose to put on the cover this very brooding photograph of this sculpture in the garden. And I would say in this piece, which was largely dedicated to MoMA, Yves Alambois, Benjamin Buchloh, Cindy Davidson, Mark Wigley, Todd Eberly, and Louise Lawler, all pretty much destroyed the museum.
But Glenn wasn't.
Glenn was fine.
That's right.
He had his museum, and you know what? It works. The museum works, and it's even getting bigger.
Bigger and bigger.
That's kind of self-explanatory to me.
Okay, I want you to talk about this. This is very, very interesting.
Well, it sort of speaks to many things. It speaks to the cultural development that's going on in China right now. It's also a very compelling and interesting museum. I think it has some problems with natural light, but you could see that. But I want you to talk about it, is what I would like you to do.
Well, I think number one is, I understand that you have chosen these images on the covers of Art Forum that reflects museums. And that reminds me of one thing, it's like architecture itself, as well as art itself. Today, an important museum very often is photogenic, especially the facade. So, and that not only becomes a way to influence the public opinion, and also to influence how architects design. It's highly interesting to see that actually today the architects, they can sit in their room behind the computer and produce Photoshop images. And the decision-making process is very interesting too. The politicians are also sitting behind the computer and watch the animation film of the 3D rendering of fly through, fly in, whatever images, right? That they decided we build the most fancy museum. And the one that opened yesterday was in Paris. That's right. The Louis Vuitton museum, right? And this is something very interesting. I don't know how they use that museum. I haven't been there yet, so I'm very, very curious. Maybe we have some most ingenious curators who can invent something out there. And very interesting. But this one is actually also a kind of photogenic, you see. But as you said, there's the problem of natural light. I guess it's not a problem, it's somehow a decision. Now, this decision actually comes from the fact that this building actually it's been built upon, not upon a computer-generated image, but it is about starting with a renaissance, a kind of reenactment of a traditional technology, which is piling up bricks by recycling leftover materials. And this is a very traditional building technology in the countryside in China. So this is extremely interesting to see how a Chinese architect also won the most important international architecture prize because building this kind of stuff. And how to use that as a museum? And it's a really interesting open question.
You know, there's something that's, if you go to Beijing and you go to Shaoxiangji, which is just sort of outside of town a little bit, about as far away as this neighborhood is from Centro Storico, you see they put buildings up in 3 weeks, enormous buildings, and it's as if they're not really married to the idea that this has to last 500 years. They're sort of married to the idea that this will last 10 years and then we'll tear it down and put an apartment building.
It's too long.
So, so I do think that this was built in that spirit. Quick, temporal, nothing, you know, they're not looking at the next 5,000 years, they're looking at the next 20 years, maybe.
Well, I guess, you know, according to what I understand of this architect, Wang Shu, I think he's one of the few architects who are trying to resist to this kind of very quick turnaround logic. Actually, his company is also very interesting. It's called Amateur Architects. Basically, the idea is really to discover what has been kicked out from the main architecture discourses and also construction technology. And I think what is interesting here is perhaps it's another way of dealing with the life of architecture, which is about growing, about accumulation and transformation over time. Might grow, might be taken down and rebuilt again. And so it's not kind of one-off consumption. So I think it has a fundamental difference between a spectacular steel glass building, skyscraper being built in 3 years and taken down in 3 years and so on. But this is more about creating a new system that is kind of sustainable but evolutive. And that's pretty interesting in that sense. And how much actually creation of art can also be understood in such a way is also very interesting. For example, one of the reasons that we do this exhibition is because most of the works here, or almost all the works, are immaterial and uncontrollable. It keeps growing, it keeps changing during the exhibition, and sometimes it makes you highly uncomfortable. Just like someone's hitting at the back of Anish Kapoor. But that gives a new life to Anish Kapoor.
That's Lara Favaretto, who's sitting right there. I have to leave you too, and I'm sure that you can go along.
As soon as you leave, I'm going to speak very well of you.
Thank you. I just want to say something about an Italian that loves Italians. I saw that there's Carlo Scarpa article in here, and I want to welcome all of you to go down to the Archivi, Centro Archivi, because we have a great installation there with architects talking about architecture, and there is a great phrase by Carlo Scarpa, who, by the way, we have his archives here, and I think he's one of the irraggiungibili. And there's a great phrase, Margherita aiutami, I heard it yesterday, di Scarpa, che dice non chiedete all'architettura di essere poetica, perché poetico è l'architetto, qualcosa del genere, adesso non la sto citando perfettamente, perché la poesia arriva se è nell'architetto, non nell'architettura. And I want to say bye with this little quote, and remembering that we do love Italians. We love Italian architects, we love Italian artists, and we are very proud of having in Maxi the archives of Italian architecture. See you later.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.
Just as she's leaving, I just want to say,
putting these two together actually shows what you talk about the globalization and the relation between globalization and history. And these are two examples that actually shows we could talk about global museums, we could talk about global art scene and so on, but they're so deeply rooted in their own traditions.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, this root, it's still going on, it's still growing. It's not simply something that is put in a storage that you just discover it, but it has always been kind of living.
Well, I would say, certainly from Art Forum's point of view, Art Forum is, if you walk through our office, it's like a Benetton ad. You hear every language, you see every face, but for us it's just normal. We didn't make a concerted effort to be global. We're a kind of a destination, and we're lucky. These people show up, we put them to work. I also want to say that nothing you see in Art Forum is driven by an overarching intelligence, an editorial vision. I think Hanru could tell you, we're correspondent driven. It's our writers who speak. So what you see in Art Forum is really the communal voice of the critics that we employ all throughout the world. And I'm sure we have a couple of writers in here, and they'll testify that certainly in my 30 years there, I've never asked anyone to review anything. They do it themselves. So it's really simply a voice. So what you see there is really a kind of consequence of what the people who contribute to Art Forum have proposed as contributions. All we do is pick and choose come un curatore. Grazie.
Let's take a few questions. I guess Pippo is the one who doesn't agree with us. He just came back from Africa, so he has some perspective.
Do I need the microphone? No, this was beautiful, and Art Forum is one of our icons, living icons. But when did the white box ever happen? I mean, outside the galleries, because we were just tired and fighting to get out of the 1900s, the Louvre, the 300 meters messy gallery, and entering the Frank Lloyd Wright fight between architecture and art. So when did it happen? When was the white box happening?
You said it, in the galleries. It's
really, only in the galleries.
I would say that the white box happened in Soho in 1964.
Yes.
It began to happen with the rise of minimalism. But this is the difference between museums and private galleries.
Yeah.
The gallerists tend to pay obeisance to the artist. For them, the artist is king.
Exactly.
In museums, the architect is king and the artist, oh yeah, they'll show up.
I have one more thing to say. There is a strong difference, very deep difference between the gallery and the building, which is not only about museum, and which is very typically rooted in Italian architects. A building do not belong to those who use it. The building belongs to the city, the building belongs to the public. So what happens in a museum, as happens in every building in our tradition, yes, partly belong to what happens inside the building, but the rest is society, public sphere. So what the architects do, it's at the same time talking to the program, but at the same time he's talking to the city, to the world, to the history of architecture, to the people outside. So the balance is of course difficult, but it was always a tension in case. So I think that's the main difference within the gallery and the museum, which has heavier tensions on the. And I'm not designing anymore. I lost this competition, so thank you.
Anyone?
More questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Or comments?
Okay then, we've quieted you down. There are no questions.
Ludovico, I'm sure you have a lot of questions.
More answers.
I want you up here.
Maybe I can ask someone. I can ask
the microphone, please.
To love the artists of your country. And why you think that Italy, and you're not the only one, thinks that Italy is not anymore loving our artists as before. What exactly you mean today to love the artists? I remember in Bologna you said strong communities love their artists, and this is something that it stayed in my mind. Strong communities love their artists. I don't think that Italy loves so much their artists now, and I think I'm not the only one. I think you think the same. Why and what we can do to love more our artists?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a very complicated question. And I think that what it really addresses is something that is really built in to the way people see themselves. There hasn't been, for this very brief 150 years that you've been a country, a way of schooling the people in believing in what they do culturally. It's always, oh yes, well we used to be, and as opposed to we are. And I see it manifest in something I probably said in Bologna. I tell people in Italy, all over Italy, don't be an Italian artist, be an artist. The world is global. You have to simply, but you have to see yourself as a citizen of the world. You know, trust me, Richard Prince doesn't think of himself as an American artist, even though he's the consummate American artist.
But America, I think he is one of their artists.
And guess who pays the most for his artwork? Americans.
Esatto.
So I mean, you know, all I do here is say, listen, you know, as my mother used to say, charity begins at home. Sai che vuol dire?
Perfettamente. And I answer you about an animal farm. Every animal, all the animals are equal, but some animals are not as the other.
So, to create value in contemporary Italian art, then that's where the money must go. Okay, you know, the people with the biggest collections of arte povera, some of them live here, but many of them live outside of Italy. But
actually, one is in an important museum in Berlin now. I mean, the Marzona collection is now in Berlin and not here. So I mean, it's.
Well, again,
it's a sign.
There are reasons, there are incentives. I would say to everyone here, you have power that you don't realize. You are a political bloc. You know, politicians understand votes. If art actually voted its interest, if the money in the art world actually voted its interest and fostered its interest, you'd have a lot more of the state infrastructure that you need. Sorry,
maybe
I don't want to scold.
Maybe we are a bit depressed about this, but...
Yes, optimism.
And the thing you said about the artist is even more true about architects in Italy. You know? They're waking up in the morning, looking in the mirror and asking themselves if they're Italian architects enough or not. Let's be optimistic. We're growing with this museum.
That's for sure true.
Yeah.
So, more questions?
Grazie.
Grazie. Grazie ancora.
Grazie. Loro. Veramente. È un piacere. Grazie.